Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this very special webinar with our This Can Happen ambassadors. My name is Zoe Sinclair, and I'm one of the founders and director of This Can Happen, and delighted to welcome you today for this really special and important session. I'm delighted to introduce you to three of our very special ambassadors that we have for This Can Happen, who are all championing workplace mental health and mental health in general. So you may very well have them in a slightly different order in your screen, but Nick, give us a wave. And there you go, so that's Nick, and then we've got Amy and also Paul. So we're really very grateful to you for joining us today. We're going to be discussing and hearing from them their personal stories, and then opening up a conversation about workplace mental health and really anything that you guys want to speak about today. So the format of the session is each one of them is going to spend some time telling us their story, and for us to really understand the power of storytelling. And I thank each one of them in advance, because it is not easy telling your personal story, especially to a big audience like we have today. I really do encourage you to interact, to ask questions, to pose them to the ambassadors as a whole or to individuals. And you can do that using your question box. So on your control panel on the right hand side of your screen, or you should be able to see a control panel. If for any reason it's closed, you can probably see a little orange box with a white horizontal arrow in it. If you click that, it will open up your control panel, and if you scroll down, you'll be able to see a question box. In that question box, feel free to send in any questions, any comments. It's totally anonymous. The ambassadors, in fact, can't see those questions. They come straight through to me. I won't mention your name, and so it's really the opportunity to really be as open and honest as you want to be. In the meantime, if you just want to send in to the question box a quick hello to me, that's also fine to test that it's working. But without further ado, really want to introduce you to our first ambassador. Our first ambassador is Nick Janetta. And he works at Sainsbury's, but he is going to tell us of his really powerful story, and he's accomplished so much in the last couple of years, and we are very proud to have him as a This Can Happen ambassador. So Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Zoe, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am on a slight time here, so I'm going to get going. So my story, like everyone else's, is totally unique, but I think there are many aspects of the story that hopefully you're going to be able to relate to. And I've only been sharing my story publicly for the last 2 years. My journey in that time has been kind of phenomenal, so I will touch on that. But on the slide in front of you, you can see kind of this is me today. So this was taken at Chessington last year. So you've got my son Zachary, who's 4, Matilda, my daughter, who's 6, and Gillian, my wife. We've been married for 9 years in a couple of days, actually. Let's not forget the anniversary card. Next slide, please, Zoe. But what I want to do is row backwards into the past. So I've dug out some lovely photos of me when I was a heck of a lot younger, because my story, I guess the origin of my story started when I was pretty young. I grew up in a very supportive, loving family, one sister, very comfortable, no real kind of challenges in terms of money or any serious illness, etc. And in these photos, I've just taken a snapshot of, I guess, me as I grew up and as I moved to university, which is the far right picture. And in all these pictures, other than this kind of fairly tragic fashion sense I've got there, including those horrendous shoes in the third picture, I'm smiling, I look like broadly happy, but I wasn't. And mental health, we've all got mental health, but when we're suffering from mental ill health or mental illness, it can be hidden, and that was certainly the case for me. So behind this kind of smiling, kind of broadly happy individual, I was very unhappy, I was lonely, I was very anxious, I really struggled to fit in. So I always had struggles with my body image. You can sort of see it in some of those photos, but I had quite kind of goofy teeth. I wore glasses. I've always been very conscious about my weight. And when I was at school and as I grew up and moved through those kind of formative school years, I struggled with the definition of what I thought it meant to be a man or boy. Societal pressures and the pressures of those around me, I just wasn't really the sort of person that at that point understood what banter was. I wasn't brilliant at sport. I was very energetic and enthusiastic, but really, really poor at sport. And I wasn't really successful with the fairer sex. I'm heterosexual, and at that time, and as I moved, into the latter stages of my teenage years, I just felt this huge, overwhelming pressure to have to be attractive and to have to be, the one that all the girls flocked to, and that just wasn't me. So it left me feeling very isolated. I felt very inadequate. I had a lot of challenges with self-worth, with low self-esteem. And this pressure and this kind of negative inner critic was building in me, and I could feel that sort of something wasn't quite right. So I went into university. That's the picture on the far right, and I went in there with all of this baggage, with this struggle to make friends, with this struggle to understand what it meant to be a man. And you're going into quite a surreal environment, because the environment that you're going into was quite male dominated. Alcohol was very prevalent, as anyone else who's been to university will probably know. And this kind of anxious guy who didn't really know his place in the world was put into that environment, and my anxiety just spiked. I think I was suffering from depression. I was drinking a lot. The alcohol was making that worse. And fast forward to my second year of university, and all of it was just getting too much in my head. I was really, really worried about, was I going to spend the rest of my life alone? Was I going to be someone that someone else could love? I didn't feel attractive. I didn't feel valuable. And it effectively led to me feeling suicidal. So I experienced suicidal thoughts for about 6 months off and on. I would have been 19 at the time, and it was really horrible, because it was very lonely, very isolating. I was in a very dark place. I remember, taking myself out of one of the myriad of nightclubs in Bournemouth, which is where I went to university, walking home, and I just remember the thoughts crossing through my mind that, there was a road next to me. It would just take a step, and the kind of pain I was feeling would go. It was super scary, because at that time, mental health wasn't talked about in the way it is now. It wasn't in the press. It wasn't something that we have conversations about. It's certainly something I would never have thought about having a conversation about with my parents. I couldn't talk about it with my housemates. I didn't really understand it myself. I just knew that it was terrifying and it was scary. So that sort of off and on, I felt like that for 6 months. And then for me, I guess what's unique is I didn't seek therapy and I didn't look for medication. I worked my way out of it by forming a very close group of friends around me. By actually, I managed to get a girlfriend, and she was actually a friend who I'd gone to university with. And I don't want it to sound vain. It wasn't that I had to be in a long-term relationship, but just building friendships and building that kind of semi relationship for a short period of time just gave me a massive boost. And I think subconsciously I started very, very slowly to start to undo some of the negative chatter that had been present with me for like 20 years. And I started to push myself out of my comfort zone a little bit more. I started to understand what banter meant from the perspective of a group of guys, and I started to understand that when somebody's saying something about you or to you, actually you can laugh it off, and if you can be self-deprecating, actually that's quite a powerful skill. So I came out of university, I went straight into a career. I had the life plan, and that experience was put in a box. I locked it away. I never spoke about it again. Fast forward to 2018, and I had an opportunity to share my story. Don't ask me where that opportunity came from, because it was not an obvious opportunity to share the story, but I chose to share the story. And when I shared the story, and I think my story is a story of being in a dark place, but finding light and finding hope and knowing that things can get better. The impact of me sharing my story unlocked something that was obviously deep inside me, and it unlocked a purpose and a passion that I haven't been able to put back in. I haven't been able to put the cork back in the bottle. So since sharing my story, I became very active in the mental health space. So I went straight into my employer, which is at the time was Argos, that's a part of Sainsbury's. And I said, we need to do more about mental health and wellbeing. I set up an employee resource network and I started the conversation. I shared my story at work, and I started to do more and more sharing my story publicly through vlogging, through blogging, and through just trying to normalize the conversation and, you know, demonstrate that a 30-something middle-aged, middle-class man can talk about their feelings, and it was okay to do that. And actually, even though I still probably would describe myself as an anxious person, my career is in a good state, my life's in a good state. If you can just flick on Zoe, because I'm conscious I've got a couple more minutes, please. And I'm now on a mission that I want to tell people that we're not our mental health. We're so much more than that. We're not defined by periods of mental ill health. If you think about mental health on a spectrum, I have good days and I have bad days, and I move along that spectrum. The experience I spoke to you about was probably the far right, quite serious, but I've never really got back to that stage. But my mental health moves along that spectrum, but it doesn't define me. It doesn't define what I can achieve. It doesn't define how happy I can be. So on the left-hand side there, for all the work I did in the mental health space, and I wasn't looking for it, I got involved in this space because I want to try and help people and make a difference, and trying to help give other people the confidence that actually is okay if they're struggling. I won a This Can Happen award, so a Future Leader award, which was a shock, and I'm still a little bit in shock about that, to be honest. It's a shock being here and being an ambassador, but it's something I'm hugely proud of. And on the right hand side, I couldn't not resist a plug. So I did a mental health based charity challenge where I wore fancy dress for 20 days. During lockdown, it was to try and boost my mental health and boost the mental health of my colleagues and those people around me. So I dressed up in all sorts of outfits. Top left was definitely my favorite. That was my final 20th costume. That was Hulk Hogan, who was a bit of an icon. And actually, back at the previous couple of slides, you might have noticed that my curtains in my bedroom at home were WWF curtains. So Hulk has always been with me. I raised loads of money, but really what that was about was talking about mental health in a more fun and in a more accessible way, because I think sometimes mental health can feel scary and negative, and this was a way for me to kind of try and reshape that. I think that's everything I wanted to say, and I think I've done that. Been bang on my time quota.
Nick, thank you so very much for sharing that. There's already a number of people saying, I just want to hug you, actually. Some of the things that you just said is what somebody has said. And somebody also saying that their son is 19 and at the first year of university, and this is really hitting home. Nick, we will come back to you, but thank you so much for starting this session off in such a powerful way. So now I'd love to turn to Amy Priest. And Amy Priest is another one of our ambassadors who is going to share her story now with you. She currently works at Experian. And Amy, over to you.
Thanks, Zoe, and thanks, Nick, as well. That was a very powerful story and actually resonated with me quite a lot. And you might hear some similarities in what I'm going to share as well with you, because I think our stories are fairly similar in some regards. So yes, my name is Amy, and my pronouns are she and her. Today is International Non-Binary People's Day, so a big shout out to my fellow gender fluids friend out there in the virtual universe. So I'm 28, I'm born and raised in North Nottinghamshire. I'm now living in Leicestershire with my fiance and our cockapoo Jarvis, who you can see there, otherwise known as Jarvy Boy, Jarv, or our little prince, as my partner calls him. Next slide, please, Zoe. So, professional me, let's be a bit honest, this is what it looks like these days. Earphones in, at the desk, surrounded by lots of furniture that you've tucked away in a spare room. So I've been part of the Experian team since February 2018, and I've worn quite a few different hats during my time there so far. I came into the business wearing my digital marketing hat, which is a hat I'd worn for about 5 years prior. And to be honest, it started to get a little bit worn. 6 months into that role, I founded the UK&I Pride Network, which has grown and grown and now stands very tall and very proud. In January last year, I moved into a HR role, looking after employee wellbeing, and the work we did and continue to do, especially around mental health awareness, has been fueled by grassroots collaborative passion from those in the business. And we've made some great steps forwards towards ending mental health stigma, but there's still lots more we can do and are doing. And I'm sure anyone that's listening from experience today, which I hope there are a few people on, I'm sure you'll agree with me in that. My role now as of last month is as Experienced Diversity and Inclusion Manager, which isn't to say that I'm not looking after mental health anymore, but it is something that it now forms a part of a wider programme, which is exciting. It's a new role for our business, and as you can imagine, there's a big spotlight on it right now. There's companies everywhere have to get their inclusion strategies in order to get it to work for everyone, specifically to ensure they're becoming more racially aware. And we'll be looking at this holistically, intersectionally, will be actually led by the voices of those who can help us understand how we do more. So I think it's safe to say that I kind of go where I'm needed. I've never really approached my career as if it's a ladder. It's definitely a jungle gym in my mind. It's a soft play centre or a giant wizard maze, jumping from monkey bars, climbing frames, up a balance beam, down a slide. It's chaotic, but learning as much as I can about people, about what they care about, and along the way sharing in their passion for change. Next slide, please, Zoe. So my story. So I've suffered with mental health challenges for as long as I can remember. Like many, growing up, it was really hard. I was very angsty and antisocial with an attitude of nobody understands me, nobody gets me. But to be honest, I didn't understand myself. Nobody talked about mental health. Nobody talked about being gay or that you could live outside the gender binary. Or if they did, it wasn't really nice things that they were saying. But as a result of not understanding myself, the way I felt, why I hated the way I looked, why I found it so hard to believe in myself, it meant I struggled with being able to cope with those internal kind of relentless daily battles I was having with myself. I didn't treat myself very kindly. Especially after I left home in 2010. I starved myself, I had an eating disorder, and I drank way too much at uni, and not the good kind where you dress up in fancy dress and head out with your friends. The bad kind, the rubbish kind, where you buy a bottle of whatever, lock yourself away in a room and drink until you pass out. And I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I was totally ashamed of who I was. And just after I graduated 2013, I had a mental breakdown. I'd moved to London, I'd secured a low-paid internship, which in hindsight wasn't sufficient enough to sustain me. But 6 months in, I had to quit. I was racking up debt. I was still heavily in the closet, and my home life was mentally exhausting. I couldn't talk to anyone about how I was feeling. My work had suffered. They didn't want to keep me on. The people I lived with, I had just alienated, and I was in a relationship with somebody I definitely shouldn't have been. So distraught, very numb, and absolutely on the verge of kind of ending it all. I had to pack up my life. I had to get out of there, and I moved back home with my mum before it was too late. And thank God for her. She was my lifeline, in all honesty. She continued to help me pay for rent until someone could take over my tenancy. She put no pressure on me to get a job. She cared for me when I didn't care about myself. And my friends rallied around me. They let me know that they were there, and they were really kind to forgive me for the years of neglect I'd shown them. Thankfully, because of these people and these acts of kindness, I was able to start my journey to recovery. Those were some of the most difficult and darkest days of my life to date, and clawing my way back from that breakdown has been one of the biggest accomplishments of my life. The scars it's left me remind me how much work it took and why it's so important I do all I can now to safeguard myself from going through that experience again. So that was my rock bottom. I hated everything about myself and had very much considered myself having failed as a human being. So to be here with you today, being able to tell this story is actually the biggest kindness I've shown myself. Because trust me, I had some very dark days. There was many a time where I shared in the experience that Nick just mentioned, kind of looking at oncoming traffic. So by freeing myself though from shame and despair, I've actually given myself a second chance, and I appreciate it so much. I'm so grateful for it, and that gratitude runs really deep. Living in a world that told me I wasn't welcome, I wasn't normal, I wasn't valid, made me feel like I had no right to be there, no reason to be allowed to take up space. But in 2015, when marriage equality came into effect across the US, I started to believe that the world was changing and that maybe life didn't have to be this way. I remember staring at myself in the mirror in my mum's bedroom and uttering for the first time in my life the words, "Amy, you are gay, and that's okay." I came out to my friend that same day, and since then, my confidence has just grown. I had finally kind of accepted myself for who I was, and it didn't matter anymore who I wasn't. Don't get me wrong, my mental health challenges will be with me for life. They haven't disappeared. It's been a long, hard road coming to terms with that, and a challenge for my family and friends. Some of who are now able to bravely address their own mental health issues because I've shared mine with them. There's a lot of power in talking about mental health. I know many people agonize over their purpose in life. I certainly have, but I think I get it now. I think I'm here to try and make the world a little bit more accepting, more tolerant and inclusive, to let people know that you aren't alone, that there's a lot of people out there who are with you, that love you and think you're bloody awesome. Something that the fantastic Brené Brown once said, and I'm reminded of whenever we talk about mental health and inclusion, is that we don't have to do this life alone. We were never meant to. As human beings, we need to feel connected to people. We need to know that we belong. Each of us belong here, and each of us have a part to play. We all have to contribute to making this world fairer, more just, more equal. I hope we've learned a lot, but if we've learned anything from the murder of George Floyd and the rippling impact that that's been felt across the world to do better to end racial inequality, is that we each acknowledge there needs to be something that we have to do. We have to act. We can't stay silent. From the increase in mental health issues for our LGBTQ people, especially our transgender or non-binary youth who are constantly being attacked in the media and have been locked away during COVID, perhaps with parents who may reject them. We've all got a lot of work to do to make sure people's hurt, people's pain, frustration, anguish, and the impacts of oppression is felt by everyone, not just by those of which it affects. This is so that we can act, so that we can do something about it. We have a call to arms here. We've got to stand up against racism, stand up against transphobia, against homophobia, push back against hate, because you can be sure that the mental health of those affected will be deeply impacted. Mental health challenges can take on many different forms, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach you can take to making those challenges disappear, but they are active things that we can all do to help us better prepare and manage the challenges as and when they occur. One of the biggest game changers for me is being able to talk about mental health, being able to share when I'm having a low mood day or when I'm anxious. This is so important. My relationship with my partner is stronger because of this, and my honesty with the people I work with allows me to take a step back when I need to. By acknowledging when I'm having a panic attack, and by knowing that if my heart rate increases and my chest gets tight, it's likely caused by the adrenaline because my anxiety is taking over, though you shouldn't assume that, obviously. We have to look at mental health holistically. Workplace stress is often tied to mental health challenges through stress itself. Stress itself is not known as a mental health condition. However, the mental health conditions that may come as a result of stress are, for example, anxiety and depression. That's why it's so important to develop these resilience techniques. They're powerful and can really ready you to cope. I'd personally recommend listening to Lucy Haines' TED Talk about the 3 secrets of resilience people. It's changed my life. When I look at the root cause of my own mental health challenges, I can see that there's deep internalized pain that comes from real self-worth issues, and I know I'm not alone here. Society tells you over and over again that you don't fit the status quo, that you don't belong because you don't fit someone's preconceived idea of what normal looks like, then that's damaging, it's brutal, it's life-threatening. So please take a step back, look at the world around you. It's hurting, it needs you to be there, it needs you to show up, be empathetic, listen, learn, and act. 2020 doesn't have to be a total write-off. Look at what you can do, what's in your power to make the world a better place. Next slide, please. If you're someone who has resonated with what I've said today, who's perhaps had or having the same experiences as I have had, then know that it gets better. And you can absolutely 100% reach out to me if you know anyone, friends, family, yourself, children who think would benefit from talking to me about anything I've shared, then just get in touch. So yeah, that's me. I'm done. Thank you.
Done in a very, very powerful way, Amy. Thank you. Already somebody, again, lots of comments. People are really appreciating the storytelling. Somebody has said, so brave, Amy. I'm really touched by your story. Thank God for mums too. What a journey you've been on, and I think you're amazing. And that's only one of quite a few that have come in. So we will come back to you very shortly. Before we go on to our final ambassador, can you just repeat the name of the TED Talk that you've watched, because already a couple of people have asked that.
Yes, it's a TED Talk by a lady called Lucy Hone, and it's called The 3 Secrets of Resilient People.
Okay, as in H-O-N-E, Lucy Hone.
Yeah.
Something like that. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so now for our final ambassador, it gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce Paul McGregor. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Zoe. Just putting a timer on so I know how long I've got. So I don't know how I follow those two powerful stories, but you know, as Nick said in his presentation, everyone's story is very unique to them. So in terms of my journey with mental health, I always kind of explain how for the first 18 years of my life, you're going to maybe already guess that I'm from Essex because of the hairdo, but for the first 18 years of my life was quite carefree, and mental health, mental illness never really entered my mind. You know, growing up, we never really spoke about mental illness at all. And me and my family were here, and, you know, mental illness was here. And really mental illness was what I saw in Hollywood movies, what I maybe read on the newspaper, etc. And obviously, as you can see from these photos, over the last couple of years, I've been very vocal about my mental health story, from doing campaigning work to doing talks within schools, doing talks within organizations as well. And also more recently, founding the company everymindatwork.com, which is trying to provide mental health support to employees through technology. It's not always been this way, and I never really spoke about my story for a long time, and I never really spoke about mental health for a long time either. So if you go to the next slide, my story is around my dad. Now, my dad was someone who had everything on paper. Now, like I said, you know, mental illness was here and we were here. I never ever believed that mental illness would affect me and my family, because I was conditioned, I was brought up in a certain way that my family doesn't look like mental illness, that mental illness has a certain stereotype around it, that mental illness, as I say, is what I saw in Hollywood movies, and that would never impact me and my family. My dad was someone who was a full-time engineer. He had a part-time physiotherapy business that he ran from home. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, my dad went to college and he studied psychology, and he got a psychology degree. He was an amazing runner. My dad ran once, if not twice a day. He also became the veteran 1500 meter champion in the UK. He meditated. My dad went to yoga. You know, my dad read a lot of self-help books. So when you see someone like that, there's never a sign of mental illness. There's never a chance that person is struggling. And very sadly, when I was 18 years old, everything changed. My dad's behaviors dramatically changed overnight. And he went from, in our eyes, looking in, this person who was my dad, who I've just explained to you, as my dad who was very broken. He was showing clear signs of sadness, clear signs of despair, and lacked any kind of hope. And my dad went to the doctors on that day and he got told that he had clinical depression. Now, as a family, what do we do in that situation? My dad didn't come out that session with a manual about this is how you support someone with depression. So we didn't really know what to do. And let's be honest, my condition around mental health was very much, oh, this must just be a blip. You know, my dad might snap out of it. You know, all of these negative associations that we have with mental illness as a whole. And my dad got prescribed antidepressants. And very sadly, a couple of days later, you know, less than a week later, my dad made an attempt on his life. And it was a massive shock to us all as a family, because this was someone who just dramatically changed behaviors in our eyes overnight, and now has made an attempt on his life. And it was confusing, it was upsetting, I was angry, I didn't really understand it. And my dad obviously blamed the medication, because one of the side effects of antidepressants within the first 2 weeks is suicidal thoughts. And my dad was very holistic. He never took paracetamol to cure a headache. He was always telling me to drink, you know, drink more water if you've got a headache, you know, don't take paracetamol. And we believed him. You know, we blamed it on the medication, and we said, okay, everything's going to go back to normal. The nightmare's going to be over. But very sadly, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, and hearing Amy and Nick's story, mental illness isn't as easy as that. If we could just snap out of it, I'm sure lots of people would have tried. And the nightmare got worse. My dad got worse, and my dad ended up spending a couple of months in the local mental health unit. He got sectioned. He sectioned himself in the end because he was feeling like a threat to his own life. And he spent a couple of months in a mental health unit. Now, going to see him every day as a family, this was our first exposure to mental illness. That Hollywood movie, what I spoke about, was now being brought into my reality. And here I was visiting my dad in a psychiatric ward that was behind a hospital, tucked away, with lots of levels that you have to get through to be able to see him. And now seeing my dad in an environment with people suffering with borderline personality disorder, you know, psychosis, schizophrenia, and in an environment that's, you know, one that I would never wish on anyone to go back to. And my dad got better, my dad got worse, my dad got better, my dad got worse. And it was a 6-month battle. And it was a battle that was exhausting, because you just never knew what was going to happen. But it was a battle that, unfortunately, we lost. My dad, when I was 18 years old on the 4th of March 2009, took his own life. And that was when my personal mental health journey began, because what I did was I cried, I got angry, I got upset. I had a lot of questions that I struggled to answer around my dad's suicide. But at the same time, I did what a lot of us do. I grabbed a mask. I put this mask on, and I was there smiling. I was there 6 days later in a nightclub with all of my friends, you know, smiling and laughing and drinking, and all of them questioning, why are you here, Paul? You know, you shouldn't be out. And I'm like, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And I kept saying those words time and time again. When I went back to work, driving into work, you know, crying my eyes out, just really upset and confused, and not really knowing what way to turn, but then wiping those tears, putting that mask on, walking into the office, and wearing that mask throughout the whole day. And that wearing of a mask was exhausting. And it's one thing struggling with your mental health, it's another thing pretending that you're okay. It just adds to the exhaustion. It makes it more tiring. And very fortunately, about 2 years later, when I couldn't wear that mask anymore because it was just too draining, I was in a very dark place. I was, you know, I had panic attacks. I was dealing with depression, anxiety. And even though I was trying to sort of just, as we were all told, to man up and just take that stiff upper lip and get through it, it was exhausting. I couldn't do anything about it. And I was very, very fortunate, after 3 attempts of trying therapy throughout that time of losing my dad to when I was 21, to find an amazing lady called Anne. And Anne put me on the journey to start discovering more about my dad, more about mental health, and to start answering a lot of those unanswered questions I had around suicide. And some of those questions that really kind of was hard to answer was, did my dad love me? And Anne made me realize that my dad felt like he was a burden to all of us. That's what mental illness does. And there was unanswered questions around guilt. Again, living in the past, wishing that I could change it, but knowing now that I can't. And it took me a long time to get there, but 8 years after it happened, I started to share that story because I really wanted to turn this experience into good and try and help people like my dad that might be suffering in silence. And a big part of the work that I do now as well is very generational. The photo in the top left that you might be able to see is my dad in the middle, my granddad on the right, and my nan on the left. My granddad is 95 years old. He's still alive. He's an amazing guy. His resilience is phenomenal. But at the same time, my granddad has been very conditioned for that stiff upper lip, man up attitude. You know, I never saw my granddad cry through my dad's funeral. We sadly lost my nan a month after as well. And again, my granddad never ever shed a tear. It was very much, come on, you know, it's a sad situation, but we've just got to crack on. We've just got to get through it. And I look at my dad's situation of seeing his dad deal with his emotions that way. How did that hinder my dad's, you know, mental illness? What did that cause my dad to do? And you know, I can't speak on behalf of him, but I'm pretty certain that my dad was suffering for years and years and years, suffering in silence, not feeling like he could talk about whatever he was experiencing because he didn't feel like he could talk about it as a man, you know. And then me and my brother, you know, how do we talk about it? I wasn't very vocal about mental health until, as I say, recently. And my mental health journey is different because I've obviously experienced it with my dad. And now at the same time, I'm a dad with 2 little boys. How do I condition them? How do I teach them? How do I make sure they're educated on mental health so they feel safe and secure to be able to talk about how they're feeling as well? And as I started to talk more and more with my story, I realized that we all have mental health. And there's a lot of statistics around mental health in general. You know, 1 in 4 people will suffer with a mental health challenge at some point in their life. Now, I think that we have to look at it in the way that it's 1 in 1 as well. We all have mental health. We all have physical health. There's no denying that. But at the same time, we all have mental health. And sometimes when I do my talks in workplaces or schools, I ask people, have you got mental health? And you can see, you know, hands slowly go up, but it's not a firm, yes, I've got mental health. And we all have it. And even though these stories today are going to be quite hard for people to hear, we need to start having more of them because we need to normalize conversations around mental health. Because if this stigma still exists, then people are going to continue to suffer in silence. People are going to feel like they can't talk about how they feel. And of course, you know, I look at my dad's experience. That is what caused him to suffer in silence for so long and not do anything about it. So there's so many good initiatives in the workplace. There's so much good stuff happening around mental health now, but none of that will make a difference unless we eradicate the stigma, unless we make people feel safe to talk about how they feel. And hopefully these stories today are doing that as well, because I'm a firm believer that the vulnerability is definitely powerful as well. And then finally, the thing that I'd say to kind of end up is I've learned to be proactive, not reactive. And there's still a real emphasis on reacting to mental health, you know, and I still do it today. I'm not preaching that I'm the best at this, but, you know, if I feel anxious, I'll typically still park that anxiety away and I'll just believe that it will disappear. And if I distract myself with other stuff, that anxiety will disappear. But we all know that that anxiety doesn't go away. That anxiety comes back and it comes back stronger. So what I'm starting to look at is how can I proactively manage my mental health? How can I focus that self-care is a priority, not a luxury? What do I do every single day to make sure that my mental health is on top of it? And as an organization, as a society, what can we do to proactively focus on mental health rather than reacting when things get bad, when things get to rock bottom? As Nick, Amy, and I have all said today, that's all what we did. We reacted when we got to rock bottom. What can we do that's more of a proactive approach? So that's my story, and hopefully it's helped as well. And like I said, it's a hard act to follow with Amy and Nick. But thank you so much for listening as well.
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you.
No worries.
You're all hard acts to follow, and all totally and utterly inspiring. And I think just from all the messages that are coming in, I've read more messages have come in than I can read. But just Paul, somebody has said, my heart hurts listening to Paul. We all wear this mask to a greater or lesser degree, and it's exhausting. We're all on this journey for various reasons, and it's people like you who make it possible for stories like yours that can help people take that mask off. Truly humble. Thank you, Paul. So that's just one of the great work that you are all doing. So the power of the story and power of storytelling is so huge, and lots of people are sending in questions, and I invite everyone to please send in your questions and comments now, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. I want to start off this sort of conversation with all of you, and I think Nick, I'll kind of come to you first. Obviously, you know, the focus of a lot of This Can Happen's work is in the workplace. And all of you absolutely have given that message that we just need to speak about it. You know, we need to be open. So there's this huge emphasis on talking about mental health, but sometimes we don't know how to. And I think there's a very big difference in saying, yes, everybody, you need to talk, but how do we do that? So Nick, you made that decision to talk about your mental health at work. How did you do that? How did that start?
I think for me, the reaction I saw from sharing the story and the positive impact it had on those around me, I guess it inspired me to realise, I think it's one of the points Amy made, that we've all got the power to kind of make a change. And I think as well, similar to what Paul was saying, I'm motivated by my family. I don't want my children growing up in a world where it's not okay to feel however we want to feel and to be able to kind of talk about it. And I think I probably did have the support of my workplace. I think it probably is more difficult if you don't have a supportive workplace. But I reached out to someone very senior in our business and made it very clear that the lack of action or lack of perceived action around this topic in my mind wasn't good enough, and I got that person's support. And for me, that gave me the license to share. And once I shared, you soon realise that 90% of people value what you're sharing, and actually it isn't always the people that turn up to the events or get involved. It is the silent majority. They're the people that really value you sharing, and you'll never know that they kind of value it in many respects. And that's, to me, again, what's kind of really powerful about sharing stories.
And Nick, sorry, how did you know, not to go into so much detail, but how did you know which person to contact? Why did you pinpoint that one senior leader, for example?
I pinpointed someone that was a people person, like very overtly a people person. It was very clear in how he behaved, in the cultures he built in his team, in how he carried himself, that he cared about people. And I also had a relationship anyway, because he was kind of part of my broader team. So I think the people you want to target are the people that are naturally going to be more overt, not around mental health, but around people and culture. Because I think how you bring mental health into the workplace is not necessarily about mental health, it's about culture, it's about people, it's about building an organisation that people want to carry on working for and that is attractive to new staff.
Okay, great, thank you. And Amy, have you got something to say on that? How do we talk about mental health? Not just saying let's talk about mental health.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely iterate what Nick was just saying there about finding the right people to kind of amplify this topic and talk about it in a public space. But I think what we've been focusing on more recently is around how we frame the mental health conversation and approaching it a little differently. So if you're not somebody that's comfortable addressing to a person outright, how was your mental health today? It's quite a personal question. Actually approaching it using kind of questions focusing more on behavior. So, what did you get up to last night? If the person says nothing, kind of gives you an understanding. Are they kind of socializing still? Can I dig a little deeper into that? Are they still maintaining connections with people, or are you kind of managing to relax in the evenings? Are you taking regular breaks in the day? If the answer is no, are they taking care of themselves appropriately? These types of questions, you can start to build a picture for yourself of how someone might be doing. And they give you a bit of insight as to how to act as a leader or somebody just as a friend, asking yourself, how can we address someone not getting enough time to recharge, perhaps putting new boundaries in place, within the workplace environment, role modeling good boundary setting behaviors. I think from kind of experience, if the mental health issue might be something a manager needs to address, and maybe they've noticed it might be depression or things, like impacting their work, for example, then try to address the conversation with empathy and sensitivity, offering to provide the support that someone needs. Because there's something very powerful about a manager getting it right. It's really key to be able to do that, because often if that first interaction when somebody reaches out for help isn't adequate enough, isn't supportive enough, then the chances are that the mental health condition or issue that the individual is facing gets a lot worse. So it is about encouraging them to take advantage of internal support, perhaps a temporary change in work hours, but just looking at the kind of person and looking at what you can impact around them, to try and make things better, try and create that supportive environment, making sure people are talking more openly where you can do, encouraging that, role modeling it yourself. You don't necessarily have to be a leader to role model that behaviour. That's something that we're trying to encourage within the business that I work in at the minute. It's around everyone can be a mental health champion, everyone can talk about these issues. It doesn't, not exclusive to mental health, as you kind of heard from what I shared earlier. It's about looking at everything and just being aware that you can have this positive change on people's lives if you just take the step forward to talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy, for now. Paul, I don't know if you have anything specific to add on this topic, but quite a few people have asked about, you mentioned self-care and how important that was for you, and people have asked how you manage that. How do you indulge in self-care? Any mechanism, tools that you personally have?
Yeah, so I think Amy and Nick covered that first point perfectly. Self-care, I think, is something that I almost have to force myself to do, because I feel guilty when I'm doing it. And even when mental health, I think mental health is so individual. It's something that I can't say everyone should do this and that's going to help you, because we all have to figure out what helps ourselves. And for me, it's running, it's exercise, it's going for a walk in the morning, and it's trying to find that half an hour in my day somewhere that's just for me and my own time and my own self-care. And it definitely is a battle, because I'm definitely an empath, and if I'm out for a run, I'm feeling like I'm not being a good dad because I'm not with the kids, and I'm feeling like I'm letting my wife do all the work because she's with the kids, and I'm out there jogging along listening to my podcasts. But I need that, because if I don't do that, then am I going to be the best dad? Am I going to be highly productive when I work? Am I going to be there completely? So I think we definitely feel guilty when we're doing it. But the advice that I would say is just try and craft, half an hour at least a day of doing something that you enjoy. And it could be as simple as a mindfulness activity like coloring, or doing a puzzle, or escapism, or meditation. There's so many different things that you can try. Just try as much as you can, figure out what works for you, and then try and craft that kind of half an hour into your day. As often as you can. And I think don't beat yourself up if you don't. I had an exercise this morning and my mind's like, oh, you have an exercise, you're not going to feel as good today. But it's not beating myself up if I don't, and I'm just trying to get back on it tomorrow as well.
Great, thank you, Paul. Nick, a question for you. Somebody has said, do you find that work is a trigger at all for your previous anxieties?
Yeah, it's never taken me to the kind of the depths of what I shared, but I guess I've come to realise that anxiety is kind of part of who I am, and actually it can be quite helpful, because sometimes when I get anxious, it actually makes me get on top of my work and get ahead, and kind of it triggers a few positive behaviours. But probably 3 or 4 months ago, I had an anxiety attack on a Sunday night. I had the kind of Monday morning dread, and overnight it just got worse and worse and worse, and it just escalated, and my mind was going all over the place. And it's the first time I've had like a full-on anxiety attack, and I'm grateful that I was already in the mental health space, because it allowed me to process it a bit easier. But I mean, it was super scary. And actually, I guess the bravest thing I did after that was I immediately posted about how I felt, because I knew that it would resonate. And it exploded, because so many people were like, yeah, I get it, I felt like that. And the first thing I did when I got back to the office was I was open enough with my line manager about why I felt like I did. And she was great, because she actually put in some support mechanisms, and actually we had a really quality conversation about why I felt anxious, and she kind of helped me bring the anxiety down, because she put controls in place that allowed me to just strip away some of the triggers. So for me, I think, I hate to say anxiety will always be with me, but I do feel that it's part of who I am. So now it's about, one, embracing it, and two, to kind of some of Paul's points, is managing it and finding the techniques that allow me to manage it.
So, and somebody has said, so what advice would you give? And I know it can be quite personal, but when you find yourself in that dark place, what tools are you using for yourself? Or is at the time it's a bit difficult to use anything and you just somehow have to get through it? What does it feel like for you?
I think for me, at the time when the anxiety is rising, a lot of it is just about simple physical things, like trying to slow your breathing down, having a glass of water, trying to get some fresh air. But obviously, if it's the middle of the night, sometimes, for me at least, you have to just let it just kind of ride through it a little bit. When you're kind of out the other side of the kind of physical side of it, something I find helps is just writing it down, because I find that if you get it out of your head, instantly you've reduced the kind of cognitive load. And I think as well, it allows you to be slightly more objective, and you can say, well, I've written down these 3 things. Well, 1 and 2 actually probably aren't that important, and 3 is what's triggering the anxiety. I think also I think we've all kind of said we've got supportive families and friends. So I only shared my own mental health story with my parents 2 years ago, but since I've done that, I've recognised that they're reaching out a lot more, and that, again, when you've got that support network, just someone saying how are you doing is, again, for me, a way that I can just suppress the anxiety and manage it in a more kind of meaningful, positive way.
Yes, no, totally understood. Amy, a question has come through for you to say, would there have been one particular thing that you think would have helped you as you were growing up to maybe have changed what you went through at all? And also later when you started work, would there have been anything? I suppose this question might potentially have come from a parent. There's a few parents saying that your story really resonated. You know, is there anything that you think could have helped you make it a little easier?
I'm really glad that people have asked that question. That's really, really awesome that you kind of looking at it from that perspective. Actually, one of the biggest things that I think would have benefited me growing up is being, and this isn't a negative on my family, because they did their very best, and my mum especially continues to work really hard to understand who I am and the challenges that exist around my world. But they never talked about mental health. That was something that was never talked about, especially growing up. But definitely never talked about homosexuality, transgender people, non-binary people, never talking about that at all. I grew up in a community where that was heavily discriminated against, and whenever anyone talked about gay people, it was always used in a derogative term, and it was just quite difficult to see how you could fit into that world when that world vocally hated you, and vocally shared how you know that they saw you in that light, and you can't see yourself growing up in that world. So one thing that I think would have been you know especially helpful, and something that helped me towards the kind of mid-20s when I finally came out, was that people started talking about it, and it wasn't in a bad way, it was in a inclusive way. We had people role modeling that in the media. I remember Ellen Page doing a big talk of her coming out story at the Human Rights Campaign, and sharing her story really resonated with me, and being able to see people in these different positions around the world, and you know senior positions, for example, just in looking at them and thinking, I could be that person. If they're doing it, then I can do that. So just talking about these issues is really important. So when you're kind of looking at that as a parent, what I would have found really useful is if my my parents had created an environment growing up where we talked about these things, where we talked about them, not necessarily sitting them down and going, it's okay to be gay, but just having that conversation, like, you know, men and women get married, but women and women get married, and you know that little Freddie, he likes to wear dresses, and that's fine. You know, it's okay to have these conversations with young people. They start off, you know, in the world with their eyes wide open, looking at, you know, YouTube to kind of lead on how they should interpret the world. So there's something really important as a parent to just encourage that dialogue, looking at especially, you know, right now, looking at how you can talk about some of these issues with your children and in a way that resonates with them, specifically around race as well. Right now, that's a huge topic that parents now need to kind of just take a step back and go, okay, what are the kind of books that we're reading? What are the TV shows that my children are watching? Can I make them more inclusive? It's just looking at those little things, all forms part of that cognitive learning as a child, that leads you to kind of believe in yourself a little bit more and see yourself represented in the world. Hope
Absolutely.
that helps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Paul, you mentioned, you know, the generational piece when you were speaking. And I wonder, you know, just taking it back as we come to an end, just got a few minutes left. The workplace is full of generations, you know, and different ages of people. And I wonder, you know, for the older generation in the workplace who maybe this hasn't been, this new talk of mental health has not been so easy because it's nothing that they've ever spoken about before. Do we see that as new people come into the workplace, that workplaces will be transformed by the newer generations and their needs and their way of speaking? Can you see that ahead?
Yeah, I believe so. And again, you know, what I come to realize is even the older generations that don't really talk about mental health, they still have it and they still have experienced it. But I think the biggest problem that we all have is there's no education on it. We're not taught about it. And, you know, I'm quite vocal about the school system and how the school system is still very focused on academic intelligence, not emotional intelligence. And, you know, we're focused on a lot of subjects, but we're not taught about grief. We're not taught about, you know, how to deal with our emotions and stress. So I think the younger generation are going to be more vocal, but I believe with the older generation, it's just education still, and making them realize that mental health isn't a topic that is something that we shouldn't talk about. It's something that they have, that we all have, that I'm sure maybe their sons and daughters and grandkids are going to experience as well. So it's definitely education. And I think, you know, as Amy mentioned, it's not sitting them down in a room and trying to educate them. It's just doing it via personal story, whether it's people of their generation sharing their stories and helping them relate in a different way. I do a lot of work, obviously, around male suicide, and I believe, you know, people might relate more from my perspective, because I'm talking about it from my story, and I'm learning from Amy's story and Nick's story. So I think it's definitely a piece on education and getting other people to share their stories, but it's definitely not writing them off and trying to make it more inclusive for everyone. But yeah, hopefully as we see the newer generation enter the workplace, there's going to be a different approach to mental health in general. Hopefully anyway. I'm sure, as you know, Zoe, you've been in this for a long time. We're chipping away at it, but we've still got a long way to go.
Absolutely. And Nick, any final thoughts from you today?
No, I just think the fact we've got so many people in this webinar is testament to the sea change that is already happening with the likes of This Can Happen, Paul and Amy. And the more that we talk about it, but also to Paul's earlier point, I think being more proactive is probably the thing I would want to leave everyone with. We can't continue to be reactive and step in either with other people, with ourselves at that point of crisis. There's so much we can all do day to day that can just transform the way that not only we feel, but the way we acknowledge our feelings and then what we do with them. That, I think, to me has been certainly my biggest personal learning in the last 2 years or so.
Yeah, and I would say as well that listening to all of you and hearing and seeing the questions that are still coming in, that mental health is different for everybody. It comes from a different place, with different perspectives, you know, it's touched Amy in a different way that it touched Paul, that it touched Nick. And I think that's also what we need to understand more of, that, you know, mental health is a big spectrum and affects different people in different ways. And maybe, you know, if you ask somebody however many years ago, you know, mental health for them might have been, you know, anxiety and depression, full stop. And it's just so much wider than that. And I think that's also a message that I think we have to carry as well, as ambassadors of mental health. So what can I say? Somebody wrote a message here that I think sums up so much. So many people feel the shame and stigma surrounding mental health. I think this will be a long battle, but having ambassadors like these lovely people is a huge step forward in addressing mental health issues. So I couldn't have summed it up better myself. So thank you, all three of you, to Nick, to Paul, to Amy, and of course our audience today, for asking questions, for listening, for learning more, and being able to pass on to everybody else. I really thank you all for being part of this session today. And, you know, we're all aiming for the right thing, and let's make our workplaces and society able to talk about mental health and really to support people. So thank you very, very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Pleasure. I'm going to end this webinar and we'll speak to you all very soon.